The Myth of Absolutism, written by Nicholas Henshall, published in History Today in June 1992. On January 20th, between 1 and 4 o'clock in the morning, each member of the Palais Parlement, or Supreme Court, was awakened by 2 musketeers beating at his door with the butts of their weapons. He was handed a lettre de cachet, offering him the choice of immediate exile or submission to Louis XV's policies. Less than half of the magistrates yielded. The rest were deposited at remote distances from Paris and encouraged to pursue their legal careers in the sticks. This shocking glimpse of dictatorship, replete with jackbooted militarism and contempt for legal norms and human rights, confirms the liberal prejudices about absolute monarchy. But the real point is easily missed. The uproar that greeted this display of force majeure was the loudest before 1789. This suggests that the episode is a demonstration of how Ancien Regime France was supposed not to operate. Monarchy was absolute by definition. That was the point of it. Decisions were made by one man and not a committee. That at least is what Frenchmen of the Ancien Regime understood by absolute power. Not so their 19th century historians, who turned absolute power into absolutism. It was identified as the autocratic enemy of consent, the despotic foe of popular rights and liberties, the bureaucratic subverter of society's natural elites. It was also seen as alien to England. Her limited monarchy was saluted as the standard-bearer of liberty and government by consent. 1688 was the final breach between England and the continent. This is no sterile quibble about terminology. Historians of discourse now see the introduction of new words, or the use of old words in new ways, as one of the best indicators of shifts in political values. Recent work on Bourbon France reveals that 19th century historians had little idea how early modern monarchies operated. Absolutist kings were supposed to monopolize power, institutions with authority in their own right, like representative estates and parliaments, were allegedly kicked into subservience or marginalized and left to rot. Louis XIV did neither. He recognized them as agencies of consultation and consent, showing that his regime was not autocratic. He represented them as guardians of corporate rights and liberties, showing that it was not despotic. And he employed them as agencies of administration, showing that it was not bureaucratic. While the old cliché is repeated, the edifice of absolutism is cracking. The building still stands, but few seem to have noticed that it is hanging in midair. No one has assembled the materials for demolition, but nor has a case been made for a preservation order. A way out of the present muddle is to ask what an early modern monarch was entitled to do. Few have done so. For most of the period, the ancient prerogatives of royalty were not disputed, though nobles were quick to challenge them if wielded ineptly, and this introduced variations. Monarchs normally controlled foreign policy and the armed forces, appointed ministers and officials, summoned the estates of the realm, initiated legislation, collected feudal and regalian revenues, issued orders and proclamations, created new courts and administrative bodies, regulated trade, industry and coinage, granted charters, controlled the highways, pardoned deserving convicts, and were the fount of honour and patronage. Neglect of royal prerogatives is easy to explain. In England, the Whig tradition has emphasised the elements of the constitution which promoted liberty rather than authority. On the continent, belief in a rise of absolutism in the 17th century has made historians overlook the inherent powers that monarchs had always enjoyed. It can be argued that monarchs were far from seeking an absolutist expansion of their powers. Instead, they were recovering prerogatives lost to representative assemblies and aristocratic councils. Most recently in conflicts over despotic attempts to raise royal funds for the 30 Years' War. Royal misconduct, or plain incompetence, were additional mishaps which could act as starting pistols for a tug-of-war over crown prerogatives. The theme has not featured on the agenda of early modern historians, yet studying monarchy with vague notions of prerogative is like watching a tennis match on a court without lines. Prerogatives were vulnerable during royal minorities. French regencies in the 1610s, the 1640s, and the 1710s found that no royal powers were sacrosanct in the hands of deputies. The female ruler who succeeded Charles XII of Sweden saw royal powers over foreign and military matters transferred to a committee of nobles, only to be retrieved 2 generations later by a forceful ruler. Many constitutional conflicts, which Marxists attribute to socio-economic forces, can now be assigned to genetic lottery. If monarchs were consolidating old areas of power, rather than breaking into new ones, what was new about absolutism? Nothing but the announcement that there was something new. Monarchy was marketed by Baroque staging and propaganda techniques, which were unrivaled for command of audience response. Not a string was left untwanged. Louis XIV's designers, Le Brun and Le Notre, were the Steven Spielbergs of the Bourbon monarchy. The answer to mid-17th century Frondes and crises was image makers and news management. The novelty was not absolute power, but its media coverage. Prerogatives, recognised as absolute, were subject to no one save the king. Within the area they staked out, he could do what he liked. The crown had no superior within or without the realm. Louis XIV's spokesman, Bossuet, declared the king independent of all human authority. There was no legal means of controlling him if he did wrong. In the exertion of lawful prerogative, the king is and ought to be absolute. That is, so far absolute that there is no legal authority which can delay or resist him. Bossuet is usually wheeled out as the oracle on absolutism, yet his comments were as true of the English crown as of the continental ones, and under Hanoverians as much as Tudors. The quotation is not from Bossuet, but Blackstone, the classic authority on England's 18th century constitution. While the monarch retained his prerogatives, his court was necessarily the centre of politics. There could never be a rigid division between courtiers and politicians, or between domestic and governmental functions. The king naturally sought much political advice from those present in his household. Since a monarch's hardest task was deciding whom he could trust, it was sensible as well as convenient to rely on close friends. Under an athletic monarch like Henry VIII, policy was often decided in the equivalent of the men's locker room. Since the system of absolute monarchy assigned policy decisions to one man, he was relentlessly targeted by those eager to influence them. Contestants required gangs to support them as they competed strenuously for royal favour in the ballroom, on the tilt-yard, in the council chamber, on the backstairs, and in bed. This perspective was formerly relegated to the realm of historical gossip presided over by novelists such as Nancy Mitford. Serious historians are now interested in court faction and its management, but they have not examined the prerogatives which made monarchs the centre of attention. Yet it was only their stupendous powers that imparted national importance to the royal taste for bimbos or pretty boys. The rediscovery of court factions as the decisive generator of political action means that constitutional conflicts can be rescripted as gangland feuds. Resistance to royal policies by powerfully privileged bodies was secondary to the crown's handling of factions, with groups at court intriguing to replace one another in royal favour or office. It was an obvious move to extend their rivalry to estates and parliaments, which could be manipulated into sabotaging the policies of rival ministers. While despotism often provided the issue, the crucial ingredient was the existence of groups avid to exploit it. Opposition to Turgot's economic reforms in 1776 stems at first glance from an embattled parliament defending privileges. Closer investigation has identified the instigators as his colleagues in the ministry. Faction was also the agency by which monarchs ran the provinces. From the court radiated the networks which enmeshed all the rest. In the localities, kings relied on those with influence in their own right, which could be hijacked for royal purposes if its possessors were generously rewarded. Monarchs governed with the cooperation of provincial elites, or not at all. Official bureaucratic hierarchies worked only if reinforced by traditional mechanisms of power and obedience, clientage, patronage, and kinship. National governments did not command enough physical force or respect to do without them. What passes for bureaucracy in the textbooks fails the first bureaucratic test, the ability to stand on its own feet. Louis XIV's intendants were helpless without the support of local elites. François de Castellane, Comte de Grignan, occupied a monumental chateau dominating the Rhône Valley north of Avignon. As military lieutenant general, he led the nobles of Provence in Louis XIV's wars, and in 1707 halted Eugene's advance into France. He died on the road from Marseille at the age of 85, coming home after representing the king at the annual meeting of the estates. Yet the nearest he got to an official civil position was acting governor. Historians of the formal machinery have overlooked him. He had little inclination for administrative matters. his real interests being hunting, feasting, and entertaining. He was not an official, but a broker, who distributed crown patronage to persuade local power groups to support royal policy. The king's relationship with such a man could be based only on cooperation, not on command. In no sense were orders autocratically transmitted down a bureaucratic line. The trick was to persuade groups with independent power that their interest overlapped with the monarch's. Some major governmental functions were entrusted to private entrepreneurs, who collected taxes and responded to the inducement of lending the crown its own revenues and interest. Thatcherism could have taught the Bourbons little about the efficacy of the profit motive. Again, all this is as true of England as of France. Its monarchs were typical and not, as usually stated, unique in controlling the localities in alliance with local elites. And Tudor and Stuart historians have recently demonstrated how many rows, apparently between monarch and parliament, originated in court faction. Passionate parliamentary demands for Elizabeth I to marry are now traced to disgruntled privy councillors. Nor did this end after 1688. The court remained the centre of politics, where foreign policy was formulated, patronage distributed, and loyalty rewarded. Ministers were made and unmade at court, and it was royal power they wielded. There was no theoretical consensus that royal prerogatives should be delegated to politicians commanding a majority in Parliament, nor did Hanoverian kings feel obliged thus to act in practice. Ministries were constructed before and not after the meeting of a new Parliament. There was no convention that the king should accept ministers which it favoured, as Namier asserted 50 years ago. It was the other way around. Ministers who enjoyed royal favour were entitled to the support of both houses. Historiographical obsession with parliamentary parties and elections has obscured the awesome prerogatives retained by the first three Georges. Nor did alleged absolutist powers of legislation distinguish France from England. Louis XIV is commonly imagined to have made law on his own authority, while in England it was made by authority of Parliament. In fact, in both France and England, lawmaking, in the usual sense of the phrase, was a joint effort. The French monarch had the exclusive right of initiating law, but the parliaments were essential to its promulgation. In England, the king's prerogative was to grant or withhold consent to laws passed by Parliament. Nor has the precise content of Bourbon lawmaking ever been examined. Most of it was codification of custom. In French usage, it also embraced declaring war and issuing charters or legal patents, matters firmly embedded in the English monarch's prerogative. If those be lawmaking, English kings made it as well. Absolute royal power was not despotic. It ended where subjects' rights began. The care with which jurists defined royal prerogatives proves that they did not amount to a monopoly on power. Had they extended to everything, this would have been unnecessary. Monarchs were ordained to protect the rights of their subjects, not destroy them. Rights were buttressed by the rule of law. They were not to be touched without due legal process, and the law could be changed only with the consent of those whose rights were affected. In 1610, Thomas Headley hailed the absolute authority of the English crown as the best guarantor of subjects' rights. Only a powerful ruler had the strength to defend them. Bossuet defined an arbitrary or despotic prince as one disposing at whim of the life, liberty, and prosperity of his subjects, who were therefore slaves. Despotism was incompatible with law and had no place in France. Yet many historians still impose on early modern monarchy a despotic model which was abhorrent to contemporaries. To insist on the presence of consent in absolutist states is to say something new about a concept usually defined in terms of its absence. In France, taxes could not legitimately be changed or increased without the consent of the bodies empowered to give it. In the absence of the Estates General, this privilege devolved on the provincial estates and parlements. Where they proved uncooperative, royal ministers could either negotiate until consent was obtained, or proceed without it. The first option involved patience, and the second a risk. Despotic monarchs invited revolt. Until the middle of the 18th century, despotism was blundered into, rather than planned. But the rise of the Enlightenment made coercion a respectable option. It was sanitized in the name of the higher law, of reason, where the organs of consultation were dominated by selfish or reactionary interest groups, as they usually were. An enlightened minister, like Turgot, now coolly ignored them. The uniqueness of the enlightened despots has not been stressed. They are vaguely presented as the culmination of autocratic absolutism. Far from it. They flouted the consensual conventions which their absolutist predecessors had respected. In 1749, Controller General Henshall proposed the 20th. It was a revolutionary tax. Clergy and nobles were not to be exempted, and, far from restricting to wartime emergencies, it was to be permanent. The Parlement of Paris stalled, and after appropriate expressions of concern for the pockets of the lower orders, agreed. The clergy threatened to abandon their churches and refused. The 20th was consequently paid by the laity, noble and commoner, and not by the clergy. 40 years later, the new tax package of Louis XVI's enlightened minister Brienne met a different fate. Its sabotage by the parlements provoked the ministry to abolish their legislative powers and remodel their membership. The result was a ruling class strike and the collapse of the absolute monarchy. The Habsburgs also responded variously to the consultative imperative. Reacting to the same pressures as Henshall, in 1748 Maria Theresa dispatched Haugwitz to the provincial estates to secure agreement to the termination of tax exemptions for the nobility. In the progress reminiscent of a Middle Eastern tour by an American Secretary of State, he patiently presented his government's case to sceptical audiences in Carinthia, Carniola, Styria and Tyrol. The outcome was the introduction of a new tax deal with the agreement of most of the Habsburg territories. 30 years later, Joseph II had benefited from the oversimplified nostrums of the Enlightenment. He informed his opponents that he did not need their consent for doing good. Reform procedures were despotic. Estates' consultative powers were abolished, together with subjects' corporate privileges. The programme was even more sweeping than Louis XVI's, and the result was the same. He died in 1790 as revolt engulfed his dominions. The discovery of a consultative component in absolutism exposes another myth, the obsessive defence of rights and privileges in the face of every appeal. The truth was too undramatic to be noticed. Most reforms of law and property rights, including taxation, were achieved not in defiance of representative bodies, but with their agreement. In a monarchical system, they limited royal power by restricting the activities which it could encompass by itself. But this was a limitation only if it assumed that monarchs wanted authority that was unlimited. Most respected law and the rights it defended, and did not. In a positive sense, representative estates legitimised the entry of a king's authority into areas of immunity which his prerogative could not reach. 19th century Whigs regarded them as a check on royal power. In fact, they existed to extend it. This corrects another myth, that absolute monarchs preferred organs of consent which were weak or non-existent. A reduced role for representative bodies has always been a central feature of absolutism. Yet Isabella of Castile was repeatedly described as an absolute monarch, even though she regularly consulted a powerful representative assembly, the Cortes. The explanation for this paradox is that a vital distinction has not been made. Absolute power jealously excluded representative bodies from areas traditionally subject to the royal prerogative. It could not exclude them from issues touching subjects' rights without incurring the charge of despotism. If we forget the monopoly of power usually identified with absolutism, absolute monarchy becomes compatible with other sources of authority, corporate and representative. The status of consultative assemblies within the context of absolute monarchies can be reassessed. Instead of locating them on the fringe, we can recognise their centrality. Interpretation of rights to life, liberty and prosperity varied. Property was the most obsessively defended. It must be seen in the context of a society based on kinship and lineage, and drenched in conceptions of honour. A gentleman's self-respect was found on the deference paid by law and custom to his possessions. Freedom of expression was represented in absolutist states as much as in republics, and sometimes more so. The Spanish Habsburgs and French Bourbons frequently encouraged public discussion of politics, while in 1746 the Venetian Senate banned it. In the early part of the period, the press was severely censored by most governments, irrespective of whether they had been considered absolutist or limited. France enjoyed freedom of the press in practice by the later 18th century, especially when Malesherbes was censored from the 1750s. Austria, Prussia, and Russia abolished or curtailed censorship by royal decree. Simultaneously, the Genevan Republic was busy condemning Rousseau. In 1762, it ordered his books to be burned and the author to be arrested if he set foot in the city. Rights were enshrined in law and guarded by estates and parliaments. there has been little comparative investigation of their powers and composition, though work is now beginning. Modern research is discovering teeming forms of representative life where it had been pronounced extinct. All European states retained a rich variety, national, provincial or local. Consultation was not unique to England, and national parliament was, and that made it more noticeable. The Vanishing Act performed by representative bodies is a common theme of absolutism. Yet all is not as it seems. The Cortes of Castile is written off as a moribund institution, which the Crown gladly put down. It met for the last time in 1664, yet it had been more active in preceding decades than ever before. Royal management and bribery were prerequisites. Chief Minister Olivares sat as a deputy. In the Cortes, the Crown had centralised the mechanisms of consent, but it had to apply to the cities represented if its requests went beyond the Assembly's competence. The decision was therefore taken to return to direct negotiation with the cities. If this is absolutism in action, it is an odd performance. Consultation was not terminated. It continued at a lower level. Authority was not centralised but devolved, and the Cortes was destroyed not by the power of the Crown, but by the power of the cities. So how was the myth of absolutism created? It began with Fortescue in the 15th century. He launched the attractive and indestructible notion that parliaments were uniquely English. It was inaccurate history, but serviceable propaganda against the French national enemy. So was the deliberate blurring by English political theory during the wars against Louis XIV of the distinction between absolute and despotic power. The French protested in vain against a willful attempt to discredit their system of government. The equation of French absolute monarchy with lawless despotism became official in England. 3 centuries later, many historians are unwilling or unable to unscramble these two concepts. Most conceptual isms were coined in the early 19th century, in a vein of pejorative mockery. Nationalism, socialism, communism, capitalism, conservatism and liberalism. The excesses and instability of the revolutionary period produced a backlash after 1815. Politics were polarised. On the side of newly labelled liberalism were the adherents of freedom of the press, a parliamentary constitution, and an emasculated clergy. On the other were the devotees of divine right, hereditary monarchy, and the alliance of throne and altar. In Central Europe, a blanket of censorship was imposed, and secret police proliferated. Representative estates were abolished, civil liberties truncated, and associations banned. In Austria, permission had to be obtained for a dance employing an orchestra of more than 2 instruments. In France, newspapers were confined to reporting facts and weather forecasts. If there was no early modern confrontation between absolutist and liberal forces, there was now. In 1823, Ferdinand VII of Spain overthrew the liberal constitution which he had been forced to grant. The result was revolt. The ministers of the restored Louis XVIII of France sent an army to rescue him. French liberals were aghast. In their eyes, the Spanish Revolution was 1789 reenacted. Amid uproar in the Chamber of Deputies, government supporters protested against their treatment by the liberals and disowned the oppressive regime which they were accused of wishing to impose on Spain. The word they used to describe it was absolutism. They had been groping for the word, and presumably had not discovered it. If it was used before, it had not passed into common parlance. Now it did. It represented a deliberate travesty of the conservative position. No constitution, no parliament, no rights. That is why it is hard to define absolutism without caricaturing it. It was coined to identify contemporary tyranny and not as a tool of historical analysis. But it stuck. And it was projected back onto the Ancien Regime. Henceforth, its pastel subtleties were viewed in the strident primary colours of the age of Metternich and Charles X. The crude confrontations of Ferdinand VII's reign were substituted for the sophisticated balances of Louis XIV's. Absolute and shared power, which had operated side by side, now became opposed types of government, as overheated historical imaginations sought to make sense of early modern states in the light of their own exhilarating polarities. But real absolutism did not end in 1789. It began. By the 1850s, absolutism had established itself in the history books as firmly as in the palaces of Central and Southern Europe. It soon fused conveniently with another 19th century experience, the rise of nation-states, with huge armies and modern bureaucracies. Liberals rightly regarded them as the pillars of the absolutism they confronted, and they were prominent among 19th century historians. Present preoccupations again defined perspectives on the past. Standing armies and bureaucratic devices, as they existed in the 1860s and 1870s, were now detected in the France of Louis XIV. They too became part of absolutism. Absolutist historiography was not launched on an entirely negative platform. Nationalists decided that early modern monarchs had confronted the separatist forces obstructing the rise of the nation-state. Thus later 19th century historians downgraded the provincial organs of consent, not because early modern people found them inadequate, but because they bored over excited nationalists. The vital requirement was to provide suitable pedigrees for the new national units. Simultaneously, the historical discipline was established in the European universities, with national history dominating the agenda. The main themes of the early modern period were defined, and absolutism was among them. The concept perpetuates a 19th century attempt to label as despots the absolute monarchs of the early modern period. Both English and French Ancien Regimes operated in a consultative and a prerogative mode, respectfully limited and absolute. But the 19th century experienced absolute and limited monarchy only as alternative systems of government. This perspective was fatal for understanding a period when kings could not function legitimately without both modes of operation. To suit their national mythologies, historians spotlit the absolute mode in France and the limited mode in England. Sophisticated early modern regimes were reduced to a single modus operandi, and hence to the confrontational caricatures which have survived. Myths are based on a pinch of truth. In the last days of the Ancien Regime, French kings did act despotically, in search of shortcuts to desirable reforms for which no consent was forthcoming, but no Frenchman equated despotism with their constitution. Until quite late in 1789, the old constitution was what most wanted. Despotism was seen as its negation. The concept of absolutism erects into an organized system what was almost unanimously recognized as a malfunction. The absolute monarchies of the early modern period bore little resemblance to absolutist 19th century states. They were less autocratic, less despotic, and less bureaucratic. With these insights, historians have recently tried to qualify the original concept of Ancien Regime absolutism, but it is rarely clear which definition, hard or soft, is being deployed. The result is a historiographical muddle. The absolutist scenario is beyond repair. No amount of cutting or rewriting can save it. To retain the title of absolutism while removing most of the content is a hopelessly confusing half-measure. There seems little point in further extending its run. When impresarios shred the scripts and sack the cast, they commonly take off the play. With the loss of its autocrats and its bureaucrats, its theory and its practice, absolutism should heed the age-old advice. Kindly leave the stage.